It was made very, very clear that all of the attractions there were not for us. That was for, underprivileged children and children that were terminally ill that couldn't go to like Disneyland.
For 30 years, the world thought it knew exactly what it was like to grow up as a Jackson kid at Neverland. A private zoo, a Ferris wheel spinning in the backyard, a movie theater with 50 seats and nobody to share it with but 3 lucky children who never had to ask permission for anything. It was the ultimate childhood fantasy, dreamed up and built by the most famous entertainer on the planet for the 3 people he loved most. Except that's not the story his daughter tells. In August 2026, Paris Jackson sat down across from Alex Cooper on Call Her Daddy, one of the biggest podcasts in the world, and gave one of the most candid interviews of her life. Over the course of that conversation, she didn't just reminisce about her childhood. She quietly dismantled a myth that had followed her family for 3 decades, and what she replaced it with was stranger, sadder, and in some ways more human than anything the tabloids ever printed. Let's get into what she actually said. Before we get to Paris's version, it's worth remembering just how enormous the myth of Neverland actually was. Michael Jackson bought the property in Santa Barbara County, California, in the late 1980s, years before Paris was even born. He didn't just move in. He transformed the land into something that looked more like a private theme park than a residence. There was a fully operational amusement park with rides, a menagerie of exotic animals, a movie theater built to seat dozens, and a miniature train complete with its own station, because a regular driveway apparently wasn't magical enough. He named it after the fictional island in Peter Pan, the place where children never have to grow up. It was a name that did as much work as any biography ever could. For years, magazine profiles and television specials treated Neverland as shorthand for a certain kind of untouchable fairy tale privilege. The public imagined Paris, her older brother Prince, and her younger brother BG, who went by Blanket for most of their childhood, as 3 kids who woke up every morning with an entire amusement park at their disposal. Feed the giraffes before breakfast. Ride the Ferris wheel after lunch. Never wait in line. Never hear the word no. It was a good story. It just wasn't hers. Sitting across from Alex Cooper, Paris opened with a correction that reframed everything that followed. She explained that she didn't actually spend her whole childhood at Neverland the way most people assume. Her time living on the ranch was limited to roughly the first 7 years of her life, a window that ended long before most of the childhood memories people associate with her even took shape. And when Alex asked to describe what an average day actually looked like inside those famous gates, the answer wasn't rides or animals. It was startlingly ordinary. She would wake up, walk down the hall, and go to school. Her classroom happened to be a room inside the estate instead of a building down the street, but the rhythm was the same as any homeschooled kid anywhere. Lessons, chores, homework, repeat. Paris had been open about the fact that her family moved frequently in those years too, which only chips further away at the idea of Neverland as some fixed, permanent playground she never left. It's a strange thing to sit with, a property famous enough to have its own name, its own mythology, its own place in pop culture as a symbol of childhood excess. And the child who actually lived there describes her time there in terms of a classroom and a schedule, not a roller coaster, a homework routine. So if she wasn't spending her afternoons on the Ferris wheel, then what was that Ferris wheel actually for? This is a part of the interview that landed hardest, and it's the detail that has been quoted and recorded across entertainment outlets in the days since it aired. Paris explained that access to the rides, the zoo, and the movie theater wasn't something she and her brothers were simply handed. It was conditional. It had to be earned. She described what she called a consistent thread running through her entire upbringing, one that started at Neverland and followed the family wherever they lived afterward. If you were good, if you did your chores, if you finished your homework and did what you were supposed to do, then on the weekends you might get to see some animals, ride a few rides, or catch a movie in the private theater. Might, not a daily entitlement. Not something that came standard with being a Jackson kid. Something closer to a privilege you negotiated for, the same way any child anywhere negotiates for dessert or screen time. But the detail that really flips the entire narrative on its head is what Paris said about who those attractions were actually built for. She was direct about it. The rides, the zoo, the theater weren't primarily there for her or her brothers at all. It had been made unmistakably clear to them, growing up, that none of it belonged to them. Those attractions existed largely for children who couldn't otherwise access something like that experience. Kids from underprivileged backgrounds and children battling terminal illness. The kind of visitors who might never get the chance to go to a place like Disneyland on their own. Picture that for a second. A house with a private zoo and an amusement park a few dozen yards from your bedroom window. And you're told, plainly and repeatedly, that it isn't yours. It's on loan to you, occasionally as a reward, while its real purpose is to give something to strangers who need it more. It reframes Neverland from a monument to one family's excess into something closer to a quiet, semi-private charity operation that a family happened to live inside of. And it explains one of the more oddly ordinary details Paris shared. When she and her siblings did her reward for behaving, it wasn't always some exclusive, only at Neverland experience. Sometimes it was a trip to Chuck E. Cheese. Sometimes it was Circus. The same outings any American family might use to celebrate a good report card, except this family happened to have their own amusement park sitting empty back home. The chores for ride system wasn't the only rule that shaped Paris's early years. She also spoke about something else that had nothing to do with earning privileges and everything to do with protecting the family from a level of fame most people never have to think about. Growing up, she and her brothers were often photographed wearing masks or other face coverings in public, a detail that used to draw criticism and confusion from onlookers who saw it as strange or even troubling. Paris explained at the time it never bothered her because it came with an explanation that made sense to the child. Cover your face now, and later you can go somewhere ordinary like Chuck E. Cheese and actually blend in. Nobody will recognize you. You'll get to be normal for an afternoon. To a kid who didn't yet understand what it meant to be recognized everywhere, that trade felt logical rather than restrictive. It's a small detail, but it says something bigger about the entire structure of that childhood. Every rule, whether it was about earning access to the rides or wearing a mask in public, seems to have existed to buy the children brief windows of something resembling a normal life. The zoo and the Ferris wheel weren't the reward for being a Jackson. Blending into a crowd at a pizza arcade was. Paris also touched on something more personal during the conversation. What it was like to understand gradually just how famous her father actually was. She said she always knew he was famous, but she didn't grasp the scale of it for a long time. She described looking out a hotel window as a child, on one of the rare occasions when a disguise didn't work, and seeing a sea of people outside holding signs, waiting for a glimpse of him. She wasn't naive enough to think that was a normal experience, she said, but she also didn't yet understand just how far that fame actually reached. Despite the strictness, despite the earned privileges and the masks and the constant management of public exposure, Paris's memories of her father himself remain warm, even tender. When Alex Cooper asked her to describe him, she didn't hesitate. She called him a really funny guy. She called him her best friend. She's also described herself, in this and other interviews over the years, as his little princess, a phrase that captures a closeness that doesn't quite fit the public's image of a distant, larger-than-life pop icon. That warmth matters, because it's easy for a story like this one to slide into something darker than Paris ever intended. The revelation that the rides weren't for the kids, that access was conditional, that a childhood at one of the most famous properties on Earth was actually built around structure and restriction rather than indulgence, could be framed as a story about deprivation. Paris doesn't frame it that way. She frames it as discipline with a purpose, discipline that came from a father who was trying, in his own unconventional way, to keep his children grounded inside a life that had almost nothing grounded about it. Michael Jackson died in June of 2009, when Paris was just 11 years old. Prince was 12. Bee Gee was 7. In the years since, Paris has spoken in other interviews about how difficult that loss was to process, describing the aftermath as something like a crash course in social skills, a sudden, disorienting transition from a tightly controlled, sheltered existence into an outside world she'd barely had to navigate on her own. That kind of grief doesn't resolve neatly, and Paris has never pretended that it did. What she has said consistently, across the years and again on this podcast, is that despite everything, despite the complexity of his legacy and the scrutiny that still surrounds his name nearly 2 decades after his death, her memory of him as a father is anchored in something simple. He made her laugh. He was, in her words, her best friend. It would have been easy for Paris to use a platform as massive as Call Her Daddy to relitigate every headline ever written about her family. She didn't do that. Instead, she offered something quieter and, in its own way, more effective. A first-hand account, delivered on her own terms, of what her childhood actually looked like from the inside. That distinction matters more than it might seem. Paris grew up as a subject of other people's storytelling long before she was old enough to have any say in it. She had no control over how Neverland was portrayed in the press, no control over how a home shaped by discipline and charity got flattened into a symbol of celebrity excess, no control over how the world processed her father's legacy while she was still a child trying to process her own grief. Sitting across from Alex, Cooper decades later, she finally got to describe her own memories in her own words, without a tabloid filling in the gaps for her. Beyond Neverland, Paris used the conversation to open up about other chapters of her life, too. She discussed getting sober in 2020, a milestone she has described as one of the most significant turning points of her adult life. She talked about the end of her engagement to producer Justin Long and what she's learned about herself in its aftermath. And she looked ahead as much as she looked back, pointing to new music on the horizon. Her latest album, Happiest Day of My Life, arrived that same month, a title that reads almost like commentary on everything else she just described. The physical estate that inspired all of this no longer exists in any recognizable form. Michael Jackson largely stepped away from the property after the child molestation charges he faced in 2003, charges on which he was acquitted in 2005. He never returned to live there full-time. The rides, the zoo animals, and the train were dismantled and removed years before an investor eventually purchased the land in 2020, renamed it, and closed it off from the public for good. What was once a place that needed its own train station to move guests around now sits behind gates that don't open for anyone. But the more interesting ending isn't about the property. It's about the story. For 30 years, the public held on to an image of 3 children living inside an unlimited playground, free to ride and roam whenever boredom struck. Paris's account replaces that fantasy with something far more disciplined, far more ordinary, and in its own strange way, more generous than anyone ever gave Neverland credit for. A classroom instead of a carnival, a chore chart instead of a free pass, a father who built something extraordinary, and then spent as much energy keeping his own kids at arm's length from it as he did sharing it with children who needed it more. Whether that changes how the world remembers Michael Jackson's most famous property, or simply adds one more layer to a legacy that remains endlessly debated, is now something everyone gets to decide for themselves. What's clear is that Paris Jackson finally got to tell this particular story her way, on her own schedule, to millions of people at once. And after 30 years of other people writing that story for her, that might be the most significant detail of all.